Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now, do we have quite the episode today? We're going to try to keep a little bit more laid back, less formal. We're going to be discussing the whole UN summit because every year these people must get together. They must make complete fools out of themselves no matter what they say. Nobody comes out of a UN summit looking good, if you ask me. What do you say?
Yeah, because the narratives are at this point they're so labored. Um, just contrast what Tusk was saying compared to what Trump was saying. Uh, you also get the feeling that a lot of world leaders and elites maybe aren't too aware of the kind of massive shifts that are happening, and
Yeah, and
get a better sense of that shift listening to Trump's speech. Chaotic as that may depict American policy, internal and national. But nonetheless, you get a better idea of what to expect, say, in the next 5, 10 years from his speech than Tusk. But
oh
yeah,
yeah,
it's
definitely.
I mean, there's a lot of pretty words and ideas that are made. It's kind of like listening to, well, it's listening to politicians.
Now, before we get too much into Trump's speech, which again I do want to discuss, that's kind of going to be the focal point. I wanted to address a bit of what Macron said. Now, Macron, he was up there, he was talking, he was basically being the face of neoliberalism. All the neoliberal outlets were calling him the new leader of the free world, and we're saying, is France ready to step up to the task? But one particular part of his speech I found interesting is he was talking about the Israel-Palestine issue, and he said the U.S. can't claim to be a peace negotiator while trampling all over the Palestinians. Now, in theory, of course, that makes sense. By sentiment, I fundamentally agree. Granted, I don't think we should be involved in that issue at all. But then he goes up there, he says that a week after he helps Israel conduct these strikes on Syria. So fundamentally, he's saying how he must be neutral, but then he's assisting Israel in its direct goals.
Right. And so basically on the face of it, American foreign policy is still Israel first, and American internal policy, domestic policy, is America first. These are contradictions, and the two must part eventually.
And they're coming to an impasse. As we were discussing off stream, I I speculate that relations between Trump and Netanyahu on a personal level are probably pretty rigid right now, based on Trump's silence on the recent issue on Syria with their spat with Russia, and based on how a week after the embassy move he pushed back on Palestinian settlements. So I think it's been going on for a few months now, especially around the Iran deal issue. I think things are getting chillier because Netanyahu wants to go headfirst into this, or at least he wanted to back when the fervor was still high after we left the Iran deal. And then Trump was pushing back and saying, no, we need to be more measured about this. So I think there's a growing rift. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, Netanyahu is mad because he isn't getting his way. He thought he would have this puppet he could twist around his finger. Similar to Erdogan's expectations to Trump. He thought, oh, we can just manipulate this buffoon however we want. He's going to be such an easy puppet. But then he's actually experiencing pushback and he's frustrated.
Right. With reference to Netanyahu, of course, Israel now has declared itself officially a Jewish state, and Arabic is being removed from public signs. So, I mean, Israel has no interest in a dual state solution. They have a solution of removal or genocide, whichever of the two comes about. It's been a slow, gradual push towards this direction, but that is where it's going. And I think that's obviously going to make enemies out of Trump. Trump is not, Trump will either have to be quiet about it or he will not be able to negotiate future deals with Israel. And in fact, this is a good playing card for Trump versus Israeli interests in Syria.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because, yeah, like you just said, Trump, he may have his Zionistic leanings, especially with who's in his family and his donors. But at the end of the day, he still wants to play deal maker. He still wants his legacy. It's still about his ego, which I never thought I'd be saying this. Trump's ego is actually the more peaceful solution. It's actually a bit funny thinking about this, especially if you're trying to explain this to some resistors. Like, no, the fact that he's egotistical is good, but yes, it's all very convoluted. But I will say this as before we get in Trump's speech in particular, expect things to be quiet for the next few months because of the midterms. The U.S. isn't want to take any too rash of action because that's going to affect things electorally. And then moving into 2020, things are also going to be calmer because it's going to be before the general election. So things still probably around the world will continue to be chaotic, but at least on the U.S. front, there's going to be some domestic pressure pushing back against it. So you can look forward to that. But let's get right into Trump's speech. Now, on this, I will give it, if I had to give it an overall grade just to start out, I would give it a B minus because I liked everything except from his aside about, oh, Assad better not use chemical weapons. Of course, that's all just posturing. That's the game we've been, in fact, 2011 and everything. And then he goes on saying the Iranians must be brought to heel. They must be willing to act like a world player, whatever that means. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And then he went into a tangent about praising the Gulf states. Now, about praising the Gulf states, I will say this at least. Trump has been going after OPEC lately. He wants the gas prices to be lowered, which, again, he shot himself in the foot with the whole Iran deal thing. The Iran deal was actually keeping the gas prices down, but what happened happened. So at least he's trying to put the screws to these people. We actually talked about this a few months ago. Trump was putting pressure on the Saudis to lower the oil prices. So that's what I attribute that to, at least. Of course, there has to be pandering. He's a politician and in a country that's beholden to many, many foreign interests. But he also went on talking about the Korea issue. He talked about his domestic accomplishments, which I do want to address the whole laughing thing. After his domestic accomplishments, that's how he opened his speech. No surprise there. He was going on saying, oh, the economy's great, unemployment's down, blah, 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 blah. And then he ends it with, oh, it's so true. And that's when everyone laughs. Now, a lot of people on both sides have been taking this out of context. A lot of people on the right is like, why are these countries laughing at us? How dare they? Whereas I think they were laughing at his mannerisms more than anything. And then you had the resistors, the leftists saying, oh, look, America's a laughing stock. This never would have happened under Obama or Bush.
Yeah, I mean, my own take on it is that they're laughing at him giving a speech that sounds like he's addressing his constituency, his supporters at the UN.
Yeah,
Now,
which,
which it was, which it was. Now, for them, this is something, inappropriate, untoward, even silly at the UN, so on and so forth. However, I look at this. I see this as a very interesting development because this kind of fleshes out his stance about nationalism. It remains to be seen whether they can have a nationalist posture outside of America rather than just inside of America. But I see him saying those things as a kind of substantiation for nationalism. And while they're laughing, in a way, he's going to get the last laugh because as long as the economy keeps improving, his chances of getting reelected are actually very good, and that will even have an effect on the midterms. So that's the way I see it. And you're right. I think that phrase at the end, he wasn't prepared for the reaction. Also, people love Trump's honest reaction to things. Think last week when we were discussing, the Polish desire for Fort Bluff in Poland, when when the Prime Minister of Poland
he was
suggested that
president of Poland.
pre- President, sorry, Trump's reactions were so unguarded uh, uh, that it was absolutely obvious what he thought of it. He was like revolted by the idea. So this is signature Trump, and that makes. I mean, the leftists have to say that they're embarrassed. That's their only consolation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And again, I love the just Trump's mannerisms, you can tell where he stands because he may do things on policy that you think, oh, he's compromised, oh, he has to kiss the ring, oh, whatever. But then he can suggest with little things like that. You can show where his heart really still lies in the fact that he's still somewhat our guy. He's still in there, and he's still going to give a fight. And at the end of the day, I would rather have that than somebody who would just roll over and accept the agenda. So how would you compare this to last year's speech? I would say this one was better.
Yeah. I mean, he's. I think last year's was, it was, let's say, less professional or less worked out. I think he did quite well. He's speaking for his supporters first and foremost, and his supporters, a good chunk of them, I would say the vast majority, are nationalists, and they don't. Some of them might be hurt by the reactions of the laughter, but most, won't care and will forget. So I thought he did generally very well. You know, maybe that attitude of not caring is good because it also calls into question America's almost, as we were saying off stream, a kind of schizophrenic policy. That is, we're going to be nationalist. We're going to, less empire, more nationalism, but we're still going to, boss the world. We're still going to dictate what happens. That's not a good policy. That's not going to work long run. And in fact, that's why empires have always historically made these kind of concessions towards internationalism, is because, well, I mean, in late stage, they're mostly economic and zoological, have a zoological struggle that they have to contend with, and so concessions constantly have to be made. But you know what? As you said, this is a transitory is a transitional period.
Yeah, definitely.
So
I mean,
we shouldn't
don't
expect this
expect
kind
sanity.
of. Pardon me.
Don't expect sanity at a time like this. I mean, you see what's happening
Right.
in domestic politics. That's child's play considering what's going on in the world. If you went up to somebody 10 years ago in 2008 saying Israel and Russia in 2018 are going to have this odd love-hate relationship where they're going to down each other's aircraft, but then have a warm summit and a warm phone call the next day, and then go back, and then probably next week have the exact same warm phone call, they would have laughed right in your face, and I wouldn't have blamed them.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, or the fact that our president was calling out Chinese collusion when most people in 2008 would think, "Oh, China, that's stuff where all our cheap products are made." But
Feinstein's
yeah,
chauffeur is enraged right now.
oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you got to feel bad for the guy in a sense. I mean, he had to work with Dianne Feinstein for 20 years. Okay, Chinese spy. Okay, that's bad. But then, look, that's probably the worst job in the Chinese intelligence agency. That's all I'm gonna say. But I did want to address this one last thing about Trump's thing appearance at the UN. At least there's a couple other things, but this one I want to address in particular. So you saw the tweet where he's saying, "Unfortunately, I will not be meeting with President Rouhani of Iran, but I'm sure he's a wonderful man." Now, do you think he wanted to, but then he was told, "No, Donald, you can't do that," or do you think he's trying to drag him along? Because the compliment at the end, that's no surprise. Trump will throw the insult and then reach out the hand. And there's been this back and forth between the US and Iran for a while where you think, oh, they're going to sit down and negotiate, but then something happens on either side where it pulls back. I'm thinking Trump probably had the intention to meet with him, but then somebody on the inside probably pulled him aside and said, no, we're not going to do that.
I think that's very likely. I still don't see the evidence for Trump um, sort of weaned by the neocons to the point where he can kind of make some of these decisions on his own with a very short period of speculation about what to do, and ultimately that will make some of the warmongers in his cabinet happy. I don't see evidence for that, so I would agree with you that he probably wanted to. Because ultimately, like, as you say, he'll throw out a jab. I mean, he's a guy's guy. He's calling Kim Rocket Man,
Yeah, I mean, he
and
did reality TV for 30 years. This is no surprise.
yeah, and um, you know, a lot of I think there's even probably some world leaders that consider him a breath of fresh air. Really. So yeah, I would agree with you. He was told you can't do that. You can't meet with them if they're this big bad evil villain running amok in the world and has to be stopped. You can't just go for a meeting. So I think it's it's tactics, it's strategy right
Yeah.
now.
And I think we're at the point where people like Putin, people like Rouhani, know that Trump and the people around him are definitely not on the same page. Like, for example, I think that private meeting during this Helsinki summit, they had a private 45 meeting. I think it was probably Trump saying, oh, yeah, there's people around me who want to destroy you, who want to plunge us into another world war. I don't want to do that, but they're going to speak on my behalf. So don't mistake them for me. That's what I think happened a few months ago at the private meeting between the two, as an aside to that. And like I said, I think North Korea, they were willing to give him, I think they're going to let him speak to North Korea mainly because it doesn't threaten the interests of two of our certain greatest allies. Whereas Iran, it's going to be much more of an uphill battle if Trump actually wants to talk to them.
Right. Trump has done this kind of thing before where he's appeased certain members of his staff. He's had to. And at the same time, you know, do a 180. The Helsinki summit is a good example where he's depicting Russia in a way that the neocons and the liberals in the Western world would be happy to hear. And of course, the conference, the summit that he has, that was televised, of course, is uh, in a way is even more chummy than anything. It literally set a new precedent for the idea that Putin and Trump are just very chummy, and Trump is just a Putin puppet nonsense. So
Yeah, and
uh,
I think all of this just exemplifies kind of, going back to the Helsinki summit. Apparently, that seems to be the topic for the day. Things are starting to rhyme with that a few months down the road. Is that Trump said, I don't consider the Russians enemy. I consider them a competitor, and that's not necessarily an insult. I think the Trump view of foreign policy is let's see who can help me today and who's going to oppose me today, and I'll play on that based on what the current scenario is. I think that's Trump's mindset, at least. But then, of course, you have your Mike Pompeos, your Nikki Haley's, your John Bolton's going in there and saying, "Oh no, you can't do that. That's wrong." And just another interesting thing I thought of when I was discussing the differences between the North Korea and Iran summits, the possibility between both of those is under Obama very much followed the Brzezinski world model of containing Russia and maintaining the neoliberal world order. Even though he was weak in action on North Korea, he was very strong in rhetoric saying, we must punish them, we must bring them the heel. He also reached out to the Iranians. The Iran deal was to bring Iran into the U.S. sphere, which, of course, something I believe Brzezinski actually advocated for himself. So you had that. Whereas then you have Trump. I know I kind of pushed back on this earlier, who takes the more Zionistic approach, where the Zionists don't necessarily care about Russia because Russia is willing to talk to Israel, as we've seen over the past few years. But the Iranians, that's off the table. That's no deal. So I think that's interesting between the people that they both surround themselves with, because I do believe Obama, despite him being a bit of a neoliberal sellout, of course, an entire neoliberal sellout, I think going into it, I think he was naive. I think he went and think, oh, I'm going to be aggressive. I'm going to stop the wars. I'm going to give us universal health care and all the other stuff he campaigned for in '08. I think that's an interesting inversion, but I think the difference is Trump actually pushes back against the establishment that he chose to surround himself with.
yeah, I mean, even from a Zionist point of view and from a neocon point of view, you could argue that Iran was never going to be absorbed into the American liberal order, or the American European liberal order. That wasn't going to be successful, and it would only empower China and Russia in the long run. And I would tend to agree with that. So from a strategic point of view, I understand the posturing, and that too may have an effect on Trump. Although my own personal belief is that he's under tremendous pressure from Zionism and a certain powerful tribe within America. So he has to make concessions. Now he doesn't half-heartedly. They're not happy with him, but he does have to. I think he does have to, even if it's only his ego, which I doubt. He does have to look after his base, and I think also what he thinks is best for America.
Yeah, and like I said, definitely as I said off stream, not only is it Trump and his ego and his legacy that he's trying to preserve, it's also the war weariness of the American public because they really played their cards wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan, which turned the American public very non-interventionist, which again, at the end of the day, is a very positive result. It's keeping us out of another war, which I'm not going to complain about. But just on the whole Iran thing, I did want to talk about the Iranian speech at the UN, and I thought it was kind of funny and just oh, Blumph is a Nazi. I think it's funny how the Iranians try to play to the liberal world order. Very
Yeah,
smart of them. They're trying to play up to the Europeans like, oh, we oppose xenophobia. We oppose ardent nationalism. Please trade with us, Europe. So I think it's funny on the surface, but it's also ingenious behind the scenes. And I don't know. It just struck me as hilarious when I heard it.
it was like I was watching press TV.
Yeah.
They do this. They do this quite a lot. Yeah, I mean, there's RT even does this once in a while. It's just strategy. I'm very sure America does the same thing. They like to stir up, uh, with reference to Russia. They like to stir up, uh, say, nationalistic pride in Ukraine and Poland and Lithuania and what have you. Meanwhile, they're also supposed to be this liberal order of openness and tamping down on nationalism because, well, you'll just get another World War II if you don't. So yeah, I find the Iranians funny. I mean, I don't. Even the liberals don't believe it. But it's just rhetoric.
Yeah, and then, domestically it's win for Trump if he can get the liberals to defend Iran because even though the majority of the American public doesn't want another war, they're not necessarily a fan of the Iranians themselves. So it's a double win there. But you mentioned this also off air, but do you want to get into Donald Tusk and the whole European Union perspective at the EU? Since I know we dabbled in what Macron said, so you want to get into that part of the world?
Sure. As we were saying earlier, we were talking about a kind of schizophrenic policy that America is embarking on right now. Israel first internationally, America first nationally. Constitution versus uh,
You're
uh,
roboting a bit, just let you know.
a bit of it, where his language is all about inclusivity and about connectedness, and we need connections, so on and so forth. However, uh, there is something developing right now. So you can perspective, a kind of parallel perspective, and that is look at who's a minister in the German government is now working on developing a new system, a new financial channel, different and independent from the American SWIFT system.
Yeah. Now I'm not entirely sure. I'm gonna see if you know about
Enormous
this.
implications
Oh,
for Russia and China being also able to use the system, which they will, and the EU. Mhm.
you're
Hello.
roboting a bit there.
Oh,
It's
sorry.
fine. I mean, is it opposite day on the war report? Because I haven't had any issues yet.
Oh, wow. I guess this is my first time. Hang on. Let me find another spot.
Okay, I'll keep the crowd entertained, but yeah, basically what it's saying is the Germans are the Germans, the EU in general, are trying to find a way to work around SWIFT, which is the American-dominated financial system, in order to trade with the Iranians. However, doing that, it also bolsters the Russians and the Chinese. So they're seeing a rising Eurasia where what's left of the European Union is trying to negotiate with the Russians and the Chinese to get around American sanctions on other countries. So, and as he was also saying, Germany has actually been more hurt by the sanctions on Russia than Russia has been hurt by the sanctions on Russia.
That's right. Um, so I think this was inevitable. So you could look at what Tusk was saying about inclusivity and connectedness, really as a kind of a double speak about what Germany is planning to do with with reference to uh, new financial channels for trade. So you could look at one of the reasons why the policy may look so schizophrenic and contradictory is because there's an enormous transition taking place right now. And Europe is moving uh, towards a kind of connectedness with Eurasia. In a sense, they have to. They can't afford, you can't destabilize the Middle East to keep Israel happy and at the same time expect Germany to buy gas and oil that the Americans control by going through Hormuz and the Red Sea and so on. It just doesn't make sense. It's not good business sense. It's not in Germany's best interest.
Yeah, I mean,
So, so that
the neocons are still operating from a Cold War mindset where,
yes, yeah,
oh, there's still this giant iron curtain, so we have to work with the Saudis to get our oil. Just ignore how much oil and natural gas we produce, and we got to do this workaround because the Soviet Union still exists despite it not really existing.
right, yeah. So and they're they're beholden to very large corporations that have an interest in keeping that status quo that was prevalent post World War II. And on both sides, you also have Europeans who would like America to remain as it was, say under Obama and Bush and so on, and still make uh, the changes that they're taking place right now with an alternative to Swift. So that's that's not very good from an American interest point of view because that's going to have a very strong effect on the American dollar as a world currency.
Oh yeah, but one thing I see as interesting about this whole pivot towards Russia, if you will, is a few weeks ago, actually about a month ago at this point, Macron was saying the EU should be more reconciliatory before Russia, before he went off and struck a bunch of Syrian targets with Israel. But yeah, that's beside the point. But I can imagine he'll be back out in a few weeks saying, oh, we need to get along with the Russians. You have Merkel reaching out towards the Russians, but then you also have the anti-EU Eurosceptic types like your Salvinis and your Orban. Orban actually going to Moscow himself. And it's interesting because both the Eurosceptics and the Europhiles want to work with the Russians. Poland is really the only major European country that really has this hang up about working with the Russians.
Yeah, yeah. I think they feel that they are better aligned, say, with Germany. But Germany is Poland cannot consider itself a partner on the level as Russia when talking about Germany. They're looking after their own survival.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, but I mean, they will have to go along, or they could conceivably in 10, 20 years, they too can find themselves in a very isolated space, like other countries, where they're dependent on one or two really big powers for their survival. But yeah, I mean, the move is happening. The pivot is happening. Yeah.
And that's also doubly exemplified with Trump's foreign policy mainly focusing on Asia. So it's happening worldwide. It's not like some artificial change. It's not like the U.S. is just, oh, they're so bad. No, Trump also wants to shift it. And again, I'm generally in favor of these changes. My biggest fear is any mishaps or any fast tricks the current establishment may try to pull during this unstable time, which again, my fears have been laid to rest a little, as I explained earlier at the beginning of the show. But speaking of the populist bloc, were there any major UN speeches by any of them? Like, for example, were the Italians, the Hungarians? I didn't see those off the top of my head, but granted, I stopped
I
paying
didn't
attention
either.
to them after I started moving on to other stories. But I think that's also interesting that they didn't really get their spotlight, the UN, but it based on their more anti-globalist stance, it's not really a surprise. And this is about, just on the whole UN issue. I think is this the third year in a row Putin hasn't showed up.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think the last time he showed up was 2015, so it would be the third year.
Yeah, third year. I remember that speech when he had decided to go into Syria, and I remember him saying, "What if to America? What have you done?" Uh, because I mean, they basically caught Turkey with the goods, America with the goods of aiding and abetting terrorists that were involved in 9/11, and buying oil, Turkey in that regard. So yeah, he hasn't shown up. Th- I don't know really what to make of that. I wouldn't read too much into it. Maybe
I mean,
someone knows better.
yeah, a lot of leaders actually don't show up, so it's not surprising. I think there's been years where U.S. presidents don't show up. So, but again, it's all a floor show, so it's not like you're blowing somebody off at a major meeting where you're actually discussing a trade deal or a military alliance. So, it's not that big of a deal uh, as a big picture issue. Um, I didn't see much of what the Chinese said. Did you?
No, I didn't. I didn't catch anything from what the Chinese have said. I've seen their reactions. I understand the sanction wars that are going on, but I didn't catch anything from them. But
Well,
maybe
I know
some of the
I know
guys
they
in
were
the
there
chat.
because yeah, I know they were there because Trump praised them on the North Korea issue.
Right, right.
Um, but yeah, I just also wanted to just for the about the second half of the show just delve in some of the third world insanity. Like I said, you bring all these different kinds of countries together. Hilarity is bound to ensue. But I just wanted to start out talking about Venezuela. Now, of course, for about the past 2 years now, they've been just ridden problems. They've had their economic issues. They've been on the brink of civil war for the past year now. But then you have Maduro up there saying Venezuela is completely stable. There's nothing wrong. Don't look at us.
Yeah, I mean they're in huge trouble. In a way, America isn't helping them get out of that trouble because America is not neutral when it comes to Venezuela. They have their vested interest there, and it's because of Venezuela's ties with Russia. So, I mean, um, you know, Venezuela would probably do a little bit better than it is if that weren't the case.
We're accelerating the inevitable, as I like to say.
Perhaps. Other than the sort of bare essentials on what's been going on in Venezuela for the last 10 years, I can't tell you too much other than that is sort of the relationship is the same. It's been the same for well over a decade right now.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting because you had, of course, Maduro up there saying, "There's nothing wrong with Venezuela. We're completely fine. Don't worry about us." You figure he also could have taken the alternative route, saying, "We are in crisis. No thanks to the United States and the West." Which I'm surprised he didn't go with that route, trying to kind of pit the Chinese and the Russians against the U.S. and the Western world, because he could have done that, but again, he could be falling for Trump's strategy where he thinks, if I insult this guy, my head may be on a pike tomorrow. So it's worth looking at it from that
Yeah, that's
perspective, at
possible.
least.
That's a good point.
And yeah, I just thought, again, it's just funny with all these countries with all these problems. They're just completely plagued, coming up there and pretending like everything is completely fine. Now, another thing I want to get into is also you have all these sideline meetings at these giant summits. And Trump was actually speaking with the president of Colombia, whose name escapes me at the moment, but they were actually hammering out pretty solid stuff. Colombia is actually a very major U.S. ally that I would say is overlooked by most people, even people who pay very close attention. They were actually having a very productive discussion. But then you have the media coming up and asking about the Kavanaugh stuff and other domestic issues when he's trying to speak with a foreign leader. So this just goes to show these people do not have our best interests at heart. I just thought that was quite the telling story that I felt the need to share.
Right. I mean, it's even more exasperating than witnessing the press during the Helsinki summit, because they're asking questions that really have nothing to do with the matters that are being discussed with Colombia. It's part of the media. We know what side the media is on, and they they want him removed. That's obvious by now. So, and on the one hand, I'm not surprised. On the other hand, it's so exhausting.
Oh yeah, I'm not surprised. But then you look at it, you just grow. I mean, is that action maybe just asking him a question in a public forum? You, like I said, the fact that he's actually hammering out act foreign leader, that's going to make him look bad to the Colombians. And you guys, they're from Latin America. They don't necessarily think like the Western. You're not so aware if you set them out, but they do have a bit of a streak of that, and that's not really a chance you want to take during those kind of negotiations. Granted,
Sorry, you're breaking up.
I know. Okay, I'll be right back.
Hello? Sorry, fellas. Hello?
But as I was saying, imagine if this wasn't clear. Like I said, they do have a bit of that streak. But imagine have that sit down with Rouhani and the Iranians. And the media that's going to more so break the Iran stuff. Imagine if you knees, and they did this when he was speaking. Number one, the Colombians again, and like I said, they're an ally, but in stage that they're not that big of a player. And number two, they aren't as on those subjects. So again, it's very, very frustrating, not surprising, and that's mainly all I had to say for the UN. We can get into a few of the actually discuss, but I'm trying to keep it shorter show tonight. So unless you have anything for the UN in general, I can move on.
Yeah, we can move on past the UN.
Other main tonight, I would say it's half white pill, and it comes to U.S. world strategy. So it is now moving its anti-missile Patriot missile to the Middle East out of Jordan, and you'd think.
Sorry, you're breaking up.
We would want those. We're moving that. How about now?
Sorry, guys.
Okay, let's try it now. Okay, here we go. How am I?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, but as I was saying, we were moving mainly Patriot missile batteries out of countries like Kuwait and Jordan and Iraq, which are countries you would think if you wanted to wage a war with Iran, you would have those there. And we're moving them primarily into Asia and somewhat into Eastern Europe to kind of project against the Russians. So again, it's a bit of a white pill and a bit of a black pill because we're chicken hawking more against the Russians, but then we are also making a proper stand against the Chinese, which at the end of the day, is a trade off I'm willing to make because the two are intertwined. So if we want to put pressure on China, unfortunately, we have to put pressure on Russia. Granted, I would say we should be reaching out to the Russians to take down the Chinese, but again, I know things aren't as easy as they had, but that would be my thoughts personally. And there's a bit more I want to get into it on the Chinese, but what do you think about the story in general? But just one last thing I'm going to say about this. Sorry to snub you there.
No, no,
Uh,
no problem.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean
but by moving,
it's understandable.
yeah,
In a way, America has pushed Russia irrecoverably into China's arms uh, over the last decade, and
it's going to take a lot of work if we want to reverse that process, which I think Trump in his heart wants to do, but based on the influences and just the world stage in general, is going to be a very much uphill battle, even more than speaking with the Iranians would be.
oh, absolutely, because I think the plan always was for China to be satisfied with a secondary role as world hegemon, and that Russia would be brought to heel
Yeah,
for the sake of Europe. Because of course, the one thing that generally Americans and the British before them have been afraid of is a strong pact between Russia and Germany, or rather, another way to look at it, a strong kind of Eurasian pact, because that will then push, say, Britain and America to the edges. And but it didn't work. China didn't go for it, and this is where we are right now.
and I just want to say this as a side comment before I get into what I was also going to say. Brzezinski was just a disaster of a human being.
Yeah.
I mean, you can attribute basically the problems you can't attribute to Zionist influence. You can attribute to Brzezinski's ideas. I'm gonna go as far as to say that.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just the Zionist
Yeah, like I said, Brzezinski
influence.
wasn't really just himself. He's willing to use Israel against Russia, but he had no love for the Jewish state as a Jewish state, that is. But another thing is, like I said, I actually support putting the missile batteries in our Asian ally countries, such as the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, or some of the ones they listed off. But we also have to consider the Patriot missile, at least the model we had a few years ago. I don't know what upgrades we've had or what classified new weapons they have that we won't know about for the next 10 years. The Patriot missile in generally is worthless against the Chinese because Israel sold the Patriot missile systems we gave to them to the Chinese, and I believe it was 2013.
That's right. So at this point, they've all, Russian S systems like S-300 and S-400 are already probably well aware of, because of course China is going to share that information with the Russians. They're very well aware of how they function and how to override them.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I also think just between the recent hot and cold, very good, very cold relationship between Israel and Russia over the past few years, especially as shown over the past 2 weeks, I think it's going to also create a bit of a rift between Russia and China, considering the fact China, they may work with Russia pragmatically, but they care about themselves at the end of the day. And if Russia starts to drift away from Israel, China isn't going to drift away from Israel because they want that Mediterranean access.
Yeah, that's a good point. However, I think if Russia maintains Syria, uh, that's an alternative, and that may be one of the reasons why Russia is so invested in Syria right now. It's not just that they need a port in the Mediterranean; it's also appealing to China as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's again that's all a very frustrating situation. Just and I argue it's even more frustrating than just very tense relations because at least you know what you're getting with that. But just this constant back and forth day and enemies the next. That's what really gets to me. That's honestly what annoys me. Like I know I'm being a bit idealistic here. I want them to either hate each other or I want them to love each other. Just pick one and let the
I
rest of
know.
the world go on and
It's the
stop paying attention.
pragmatism.
Yeah, I know,
Exactly.
but
It, it's just the pragmatism of it is so frustrating. Yeah, I agree with you. In a way, these sort of things kind of make their own populations very pragmatic and cynical as well, because I think populations also have they do have an idealism, and I think when a government is behaving very pragmatically all the time, uh, when everything just seems like a kind of financial zoological struggle for survival, it's not inspiring. And it's often people with much less power that want a greater demonstration of power from their governments. Um, this is also, I think, part of the psychology of, why we also go to war. And it's, it is a facet of the so-called lower classes.
Well, unfortunately, I do have to get on my other show, so I have to wind this one down. But one final statement I will say is Netanyahu is so incompetent, he has even managed to turn the Israeli people against him, which again, that's a pretty amazing feat. But this has been the War Report. Just fun at the UN, just a good time, crazy world. But it's gonna get better, but it may get worse before it gets better. But you know what? No matter what happens, this show will have a great rating, so at least I can look forward to that. So thank you all for tuning in, and
Thanks,
goodbye.
everyone.